The White House stands at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, one of the most recognized buildings on Earth. The clean neoclassical front. The long lines of columns. The lawns that always look untouched, as if history itself is kept trimmed and orderly. For more than 2 centuries, American power has moved through those rooms. Decisions whispered in corridors, celebrations staged beneath chandeliers, crises handled behind doors that never appear on camera. But that image is the end of the story, not the beginning. Before the paint turned it white, before it became the White House, before presidents lived inside it and the world learned to read its windows like weather, this place was raw ground. Mud, mosquitoes, a half-tamed landscape near the Potomac River where nothing about national permanence looked guaranteed. It started as a construction site, and like every construction site, it was noisy, dangerous, unpredictable, built not by symbols but by hands. The building rose slowly from swampy soil, in a new capital that many people doubted would ever become a real city. The timeline was harsh. The nation was young and broke. The plans were ambitious. The labor came from different worlds, free workers paid by the day, skilled craftsmen following trade knowledge passed down through apprenticeships, and enslaved people forced into exhausting work with no say in where their strength was spent. That truth isn't a side note. It's part of the foundation. This story isn't here to sensationalize that reality, and it isn't here to hide it. It's here to place it where it belongs, inside the real history of the building, the nation, and the choices that shaped both. Because the White House didn't just appear. It was decided into existence. It took political deals to choose its location. It took an architectural competition to choose its shape. It took an immigrant architect, an Irishman with a trained eye and practical experience, to translate a young republic's ideals into stone and timber. It took years of quarrying, hauling, cutting, laying, framing, plastering, and finishing. Then it took fire, an enemy torching the Capitol in 1814, followed by reconstruction that gave the building its most famous look. And it took decades after that for the name, White House, to become official. So when you look at it today, you're not just looking at a building. You're looking at a long chain of compromises, ambitions, labor systems, and survival. The structure we recognize today took shape first between 1792 and 1800, then was remade after 1814. Understanding how and why it was built means understanding the country that ordered it built, what it wanted the world to believe, what it was willing to trade to get there, and what contradictions it carried into stone. This is a story about architecture, yes, proportions and plans and materials. But it's also about the early United States choosing what kind of capital it wanted, what kind of presidency it was inventing, and what kind of image it needed to project to the world. And we begin with the decision that made everything else possible. Where would the nation's new capital even stand? When the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the new government had power on paper, but no permanent home in the real world. Congress moved like a traveling court, meeting wherever space and politics allowed. Philadelphia, New York, Princeton, Annapolis. Each city hosted the government for a while, and each city quietly hoped the arrangement would become permanent. But a permanent capital wasn't just a practical question. It was a fight over identity. A capital meant influence. It meant jobs, money, prestige, and the invisible gravity that pulls decisions and people toward one place. Northern states wanted the capital where commerce was strong and institutions already existed. Southern states wanted it closer to their region, where their political weight could be felt more directly. The young republic was still fragile enough that location wasn't a detail, it was a balance of power issue. By 1790, the argument had reached the point where it could stall everything else. And in the United States, when politics hits a wall, something usually happens next: a trade. The solution came through what history remembers as the Compromise of 1790, part negotiation, part pressure, part survival tactic for a government that couldn't afford to collapse this early. Alexander Hamilton, the nation's financial architect, had a plan to stabilize the country's credit and strengthen the federal government. A major piece of that plan was having the federal government assume the Revolutionary War debts of the states. To some states, especially in the North, that sounded fair. They had large debts and wanted relief. To others, especially in the South, many of those debts had already been paid down. They didn't want to reward states that still owed money. They also feared Hamilton's plan would make the federal government too powerful, too centralized, too northern in spirit. Hamilton needed votes. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, leading voices of the Southern political bloc, wanted something different. A capital located in the South rather than anchored in northern cities like New York or Philadelphia. They understood what a capital meant. Put the permanent seat of government in the North, and over time the North would become the nation's default center, financially, socially, and politically. So the bargain formed. The famous story is simple. Hamilton got the votes he needed for his financial plan. Jefferson and Madison got the capital location they wanted. Both sides walked away believing they had saved the country and secured their future. The result was the Residence Act of 1790. It authorized a federal district not exceeding 10 miles square, carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia. The location would be along the Potomac River, a deliberate middle ground between North and South, a geographic compromise designed to calm regional rivalry, at least for a while. But here's what made the decision truly bold. They weren't choosing an established city. They were choosing an idea. Yes, Georgetown existed as a functioning port town. Alexandria existed too, with its own identity and economy. But the capital, as envisioned in the deal, wasn't already built. The area was uneven. Much of it was swampy. Summers were notoriously hot and humid. The Potomac could flood. Roads were rough. Infrastructure was thin. It was not the obvious choice if your priority was comfort, speed, or convenience. So why choose it? Because the capital wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be controlled. A purpose-built capital allowed the new nation to avoid being dominated by any one existing city's commercial class, political networks, or local power structures. It meant the federal government could start fresh, shaping a city that symbolized Republican ideals rather than inheriting the personality of a wealthy metropolis. It was political theater made permanent in stone, and one man was given the authority to turn that theater into a real map: George Washington. Washington wasn't just the first president. He was the one figure both sides trusted enough to handle this without tearing the country apart. The law gave him power to choose the exact site within the permitted Potomac area, and Washington chose a location that included Georgetown and land that could be developed into a new federal city. The choice also carried personal logic. Washington knew the Potomac region intimately. His home at Mount Vernon was nearby. He understood the landscape, the river roads, the climate, its problems, and its potential. And he believed the capital could grow there, even if it would take time, money, and relentless effort. Once the location was set, the next step was design, because a capital isn't just a dot on a map. It needs a plan. It needs streets, routes, ceremonial space, and symbolic geometry. The government hired Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer who had served in the Continental Army, to design the new city. L'Enfant didn't draw a simple grid. He drew ambition. Wide avenues, grand public spaces, sightlines that made certain buildings dominate the view, creating a city that communicated hierarchy without using crowns. His plan was European in its confidence, Parisian in its drama, but adjusted for a republic that feared anything that looked too monarchical. And at the center of his vision were two anchors: the Capitol and the President's house. One for the people's legislature, one for the executive power. Placed apart, connected by a broad ceremonial road, Pennsylvania Avenue, a spine meant to link the two branches in space the same way the Constitution linked them in principle. But selecting a president's house on paper is one thing. Choosing where it would physically stand, where the residents would sit, what it would overlook, how it would be approached, that was the next move. According to historical accounts, Washington himself took an active hand in that decision, choosing a site on relatively higher ground with better drainage and a commanding view toward the Potomac. Even then, the land wasn't easy. It required leveling. Drainage needed work. The area still sat in a region where summers could feel brutal and winters could cut through unfinished walls. Building something substantial here would demand labor, material, logistics, and discipline, at a scale the young nation hadn't truly attempted before. And the clock was already running. The government planned to move to the new capital in 1800. That gave them about 10 years to create an entire functioning seat of governmenty roads, bridges, water access, major buildings, and housing for officials. For the president's house, it meant a schedule so tight it bordered on unrealistic. But that's what the compromise had created, a promise with a deadline. The site was chosen. The district was authorized. The plan for the city was underway. Now came the next question, the one that would shape everything the world would eventually recognize. What would the president's house look like? Once the location of the new capital was settled, the United States faced a problem no republic before it had solved quite this way. What should the home of a president look like? This wasn't a simple architectural question. It was a political one. Every line, every proportion, every decorative choice would send a message about authority, restraint, and how different this new nation claimed to be from the monarchies it had rejected. Build something too small, and the presidency might look weak, temporary, almost embarrassed to exist. Build something too grand, and critics would accuse the Republic of recreating a palace in all but name. In 1792, the commissioners overseeing the development of the federal district announced an architectural competition for the president's house. It was advertised publicly, inviting architects to submit designs for consideration. The prize was either $500 or a medal of equal value, serious money at the time, enough to attract skilled professionals. The instructions were deliberately broad, but not vague. The building needed to serve two roles at once, a private residence for the president and family, and a public space for official functions, receiving diplomats, hosting events, conducting business. It needed to look permanent, dignified, and durable. Brick or stone construction was preferred, both for fire resistance and symbolic solidity. And above all, it needed to represent the nation without suggesting monarchy. That last requirement was the hardest to define. The competition drew multiple submissions, though the exact number remains uncertain. Many designs were lost, undocumented, or never formally archived. What survives in historical accounts suggests a wide range of ideas. Some proposals were conservative and restrained. Others leaned toward dramatic, palace-like forms that would have rivaled European royal residences. One of the most interesting submissions came from Thomas Jefferson himself. Jefferson was deeply invested in architecture. He believed buildings expressed political philosophy in physical form. His anonymous submission drew heavily from classical Roman ideals and from Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda, symmetry, balance, and rational order. The design featured a central dome and clean classical lines. It emphasized intellectual harmony rather than visual dominance. But Jefferson's design was not chosen. Why exactly remains unclear. Some historians suggest it may have seemed too modest for the role. Others believe it leaned too heavily on European models at a moment when the nation wanted something distinct. Whatever the reason, Jefferson's vision for the president's house would influence later American architecture, but not this building, not yet. Other designs went in the opposite direction. Grand, elaborate structures filled with ornament and scale that felt uncomfortably royal. These were rejected quickly. The commissioners understood the risk. A building that looked like a palace would undermine the Republic's claim that power flowed from the people, not from inherited status. The winning design struck a careful balance. It came from James Hoban, an Irish-born architect working in Charleston, South Carolina. Hoban's proposal didn't shout power, it asserted it quietly. The design was substantial but controlled, classical without being theatrical, large enough to command respect, but restrained enough to avoid imperial overtones. The building was rectangular, with a clear central block and projecting wings. The style followed Georgian principles, a form of neoclassicism already familiar in both Britain and America. Symmetry ruled the facade. Windows were evenly spaced. Ornamentation was minimal, relying on proportion rather than decoration to create authority. It was a building meant to feel stable, not intimidating. George Washington played a direct role in the selection. His opinion mattered, and Hoban's design aligned closely with Washington's own sense of dignity and restraint. Washington reportedly wanted the house larger than Hoban's original submission, and Hoban agreed to revise the scale while preserving the design's character. That decision would have consequences. A larger building meant more stone, more labor, more time, and more expense. But it also meant a structure that could grow into its symbolic role as the presidency itself grew in power. The competition revealed something essential about early American identity. The nation wanted classical architecture because classical forms suggested permanence, order, and a connection to ancient republics like Rome. But it also feared what those forms had become in Europe, tools of empire and monarchy. Hoban's design walked that line. The president's house would look classical, but not crowned, impressive, but not overwhelming. It would communicate authority through balance and proportion rather than excess. Once the design was selected, it became more than a drawing. It became a commitment. The basic form, its dimensions, layout, and exterior character was locked in. Adjustments would come during construction, but the soul of the building was set. The design would dictate how people moved through the space, how public and private life intersected, how the presidency physically occupied the Capitol, and with the design chosen, the abstract idea of a president's house finally began to shift into something real. The next step wasn't philosophical anymore, it was physical. They had to break ground. James Hoban did not arrive in America expecting to design the most important house in the nation. He was born in Ireland around 1758, at a time when Dublin was undergoing a wave of architectural transformation. Georgian buildings, measured, symmetrical, and restrained, were reshaping the city. Hoban trained as an architect and builder in this environment, learning not just how to draw buildings, but how to construct them. He absorbed classical proportions, practical masonry techniques, and the discipline required to turn plans into finished structures. That distinction mattered. In the late 18th century, many architects were designers only. Hoban was both designer and builder. He understood stone, timber, labor, and logistics. He knew what could realistically be built, and what could not. After the American Revolutionary War, Hoban emigrated to the United States, like many skilled Europeans drawn by opportunity in a growing nation. He initially settled in Philadelphia, then moved south to Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was wealthy, active, and expanding. It offered work, clients, and the chance to establish a reputation. Hoban did exactly that. He designed and constructed homes for affluent residents, working in the Georgian style he knew well. His buildings demonstrated control of proportion and clarity of layout rather than decorative excess. They were solid, respectable, and practical, qualities that would soon matter far more than flamboyance. When news of the architectural competition for the president's house reached him, Hoban recognized the opportunity immediately. He was reportedly in Philadelphia on business when he learned of it. Unlike some competitors who submitted idealized designs, Hoban entered the competition with experience on his side. He knew how to build at scale. He knew how to work with stone and brick, and he understood how to adapt European forms to American conditions. His design drew clear inspiration from Leinster House in Dublin, built in the 1740s as the residence of the Duke of Leinster. The resemblance was not accidental. Leinster House represented exactly the kind of balance Hoban needed: dignified, classical, and commanding, but not extravagant. Hoban didn't copy it outright. He adapted it. The president's house would have three main levels. The lowest level, partially below ground, would handle service functions, kitchens, storage, workspaces, keeping labor and logistics out of public view. Above it, the main floor would serve as the public heart of the building, containing formal rooms for receptions, dining, and official events. The upper floor would house the president's private family quarters. This vertical separation mattered. It physically reinforced the distinction between public power and private life, a principle the young republic took seriously. The facade followed Georgian rules: symmetry, evenly spaced windows, a central entrance, restrained classical detailing. There was no explosion of ornament, no sculptural excess. Authority came from proportion and scale, not decoration. Hoban designed large interior spaces as well. A central entrance hall ran through the building, organizing movement and creating a sense of procession. Major rooms opened off this axis, including what would become the East Room, the largest interior space, intended for significant public gatherings. Dining rooms, reception rooms, and smaller offices filled out the plan. Importantly, Hoban's rectangular layout allowed flexibility. The building could be constructed in phases if needed. Interior arrangements could evolve. Materials could be sourced locally or transported without extreme difficulty. The design was ambitious, but not reckless. After his design was selected, Hoban was appointed superintendent of construction. This gave him control not just over drawings, but over execution. He would oversee the site, manage labor, and make adjustments as necessary while keeping the core vision intact. George Washington took a personal interest in Hoban's work. Washington believed the house should be larger than Hoban originally proposed, more imposing in scale to match the nation's aspirations. Hoban revised the design accordingly, expanding the dimensions while preserving its balanced character. That decision would echo throughout the project. A larger building required more stone, more labor, more time, and more compromise. But it also ensured that the president's house would not feel temporary or undersized as the nation grew. Hoban's architectural choices would ripple far beyond this project. The restrained neoclassical style he employed became a model for American public architecture. Courthouses, Capitol buildings, and government offices across the country would borrow from the same language: symmetry, columns, proportion, and quiet authority. What makes Hoban's role especially significant is that his work bridged worlds. He brought European architectural tradition into a nation trying to define itself without crowns or aristocracy. He translated old forms into new meaning, and soon those ideas would face their hardest test, because drawing a president's house was one thing. Building it, on unstable ground, under political pressure, with limited resources, was something else entirely. The next step would turn vision into labor. They were about to break ground. Construction of the president's house officially began on October 13, 1792. The date was not chosen at random. It marked the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, a symbolic link between discovery, nationhood, and the future the United States hoped to project. The ceremony itself, however, was restrained. There were no grand crowds or elaborate rituals. This was not a coronation. It was the beginning of work. George Washington was present, along with the commissioners responsible for developing the federal district and a small group of officials. A cornerstone was laid to mark the start of construction, though its exact location within the building has never been definitively identified. Later renovations attempted to find it, but history had already swallowed that detail. What mattered was not the stone itself, but what it represented. Before walls could rise, the land had to be tamed. The site chosen for the president's house sat on higher ground than much of the surrounding area, but that did not make it easy. The terrain was uneven. Drainage was poor. Parts of the soil were unstable. Trees, brush, and vegetation had to be cleared. Earth had to be moved and leveled. Water channels had to be managed to prevent flooding around the future foundations. This preparatory work was slow, exhausting, and entirely physical. There was no machinery beyond basic tools, wagons, animals, and human strength. Every shovel of earth was lifted by hand. Every obstacle was solved through labor, not technology. James Hoban supervised closely. Foundation work was critical. Any mistake at this stage could compromise the entire structure. The president's house was intended to be permanent. That meant its foundations had to support massive stone walls without settling or shifting over time. The foundations were built from stone, laid deep and wide to distribute the weight of the building. This work took months. Trenches were dug, stone placed, mortar mixed and applied. Progress was measured in feet, not floors. The exterior walls would be built from Aquia Creek sandstone, quarried in Virginia roughly 40 miles from the construction site. This stone was chosen for practical reasons. It was relatively soft when freshly quarried, making it easier to cut and shape. Once exposed to air, it hardened, becoming more durable. It had a warm, light tan color, very different from the white appearance the building would later adopt. Getting that stone to the site was an operation in itself. At Aquia Creek, workers extracted large blocks from the ground, splitting them along natural fracture lines. The rough blocks were partially shaped at the quarry to reduce weight before transport. From there, the stone traveled by water whenever possible, loaded onto barges and floated along waterways to the Potomac River. Water transport was essential. Moving heavy stone over land on primitive roads would have been painfully slow and expensive. Even by water, the journey required careful handling. Barges had to be loaded evenly. Weather could delay movement. Once the stone reached river wharves near the site, it still had to be hauled overland by wagon to the construction area. Each block was heavy, awkward, and unforgiving. At the site, skilled stonecutters took over. Using chisels, hammers, and measuring tools, they shaped each block precisely for its intended location. Exterior stones needed smooth faces and clean edges to create the orderly facade Hoban had designed. Interior stones could be rougher, but still had to meet structural standards. This work demanded experience. One misjudged strike could crack a stone beyond use. A poorly cut block could disrupt the alignment of an entire wall section. Precision mattered, even under pressure, to move quickly. As the foundation work progressed, and the first courses of stone were laid, the workforce began to grow. Skilled craftsmen were essential: stonemasons, carpenters, stonecutters, plasterers. Many were free men, often immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, and England, bringing trade knowledge learned through long apprenticeships. They were paid wages, recorded by name in surviving payroll documents, but skilled labor alone could not sustain a project of this scale. The work also required vast amounts of unskilled labor: digging, hauling, lifting, mixing mortar, clearing debris, transporting materials. For this, the federal government relied heavily on enslaved workers. Enslaved labor was not incidental. It was integrated into the project from the beginning. Payroll records show payments made not to enslaved individuals, but to their owners. Slaveholders hired out enslaved men to the government for daily or weekly rates. The government paid the owners. The laborers themselves received nothing. Food, clothing, and shelter were typically provided by the owner, not the federal project. This system was common in Maryland and Virginia at the time. It was legal, normalized, and unquestioned by most officials involved. From their perspective, they were using the labor system that already existed. From a modern perspective, It exposes a sharp contradiction. A building meant to house the president of a republic, built partly by people denied freedom entirely. On the site, free and enslaved workers labored side by side. They lifted the same stones, dug the same trenches, endured the same weather, but their positions were not equal. Free workers could leave if conditions became unbearable. Enslaved workers could not. Their labor was compelled, their presence enforced by law and ownership. Construction moved forward slowly. Weather dictated the pace. Heavy rain turned the site into mud. Winter cold made mortar work difficult or impossible. Summer heat along the Potomac was relentless, especially for those doing heavy lifting. The work was dangerous. Scaffolding was basic. Stone blocks could slip. Tools failed. Injuries happened, though records rarely preserve details unless a death or major incident occurred. Risk was accepted as part of the job. By the end of 1793, the foundation was largely complete. The walls had begun to rise above ground level. Visitors to the site could see that something substantial was taking shape. But it was still far from a building anyone could inhabit. The president's house was no longer just a plan or a political idea. It had weight. It had stone. It had labor embedded into its base. And from this point forward, every foot of progress would demand more time, more effort, and more people, free and enslaved, working under conditions that tested both endurance and resolve. Between 1793 and 1797, the president's house began to look like a building rather than an idea. This was the phase when the exterior walls rose course by course, turning foundations into form. It was also the stage where the project's scale, difficulty, and human cost became impossible to ignore. Everything depended on coordination. At Aquia Creek in Virginia, quarrying continued almost nonstop. Workers cut sandstone from the earth by reading the stone itself, finding natural fracture lines, driving wedges, and splitting blocks without shattering them. The work required experience and precision. A cracked block meant lost time and wasted effort. Quarrying was dangerous, physically demanding, and relentless. Once extracted, the stone was roughly shaped at the quarry to reduce weight. These oversized blocks were then loaded onto barges and floated toward the Potomac. Water transport was efficient, but never simple. Barges had to be balanced. Weather could delay shipments. A single mishap could sink both cargo and labor. From river landings near the construction site, the stone moved overland by wagon. Roads were uneven and often muddy. Wagons broke. Animals tired. Each block required careful handling from quarry to wall. At the site, skilled stone cutters took over. Their task was to finish each block to exact dimensions. Exterior stones needed smooth faces and sharp edges to create the disciplined symmetry James Hoban envisioned. Interior stones could be rougher but still had to meet structural requirements. Stone cutting was slow, deliberate work. Tools were simple, chisels, hammers, measuring rods, but mastery came from experience. A miscut stone could delay an entire section of wall. Once prepared, the blocks were ready to be set. As walls rose higher, scaffolding became essential. Wooden platforms were built around the structure, growing upward with each new course of stone. Hoisting equipment was basic ropes, pulleys, and simple wooden cranes. Raising a single block required teamwork and timing. Several workers guided each stone, lifting, steadying, and lowering it into place. A mistake at height could be fatal. Masons worked methodically, laying each block in mortar made from lime, sand, and water. The mixture had to be exact. Too wet, and it would fail to bond. Too dry, and it wouldn't set properly. Masons checked alignment constantly using levels and plumb lines. Walls had to rise straight, true, and evenly distributed to avoid future settling. Construction moved in sections rather than all at once. One area would be raised to a certain height before work shifted to another. This allowed scaffolding to be reused and helped distribute weight evenly across the structure during construction. Inside the building, bricklayers worked simultaneously. Interior walls were largely brick rather than stone, a practical and cost-effective choice. These interior walls supported floors, divided rooms, and added structural strength. Brickwork progressed alongside stone masonry, creating the internal skeleton of the house. The workforce during this phase remained mixed. Free craftsmen, masons, stonecutters, carpenters handled most of the skilled tasks. Enslaved laborers provided much of the physical forces, hauling stone, mixing mortar, assisting masons, and clearing debris. Some enslaved workers were themselves skilled craftsmen, working alongside free men while remaining legally property. The work site was a place of constant motion and tension. Free and enslaved workers cooperated out of necessity, even as the legal system enforced rigid inequality. Skill mattered on the wall, but status ruled everything else. Weather dictated the rhythm of progress. Rain halted mortar work, freezing temperatures risked cracking stone and freezing lime. Summer heat exhausted workers and slowed output. Productivity fluctuated with the seasons, but the project never truly stopped. By 1795, large sections of the walls had reached full height. The building's scale became unmistakable. Visitors could now see the shape Hoban had designed, the long rectangular mass, the balanced proportions, the promise of a dignified residence. But problems emerged. Aquia Creek sandstone, while workable, was relatively soft. Exposure during construction sometimes caused surface damage before the building was complete. Some stones weathered poorly and had to be repaired or replaced even before final finishing. This added time, labor, and cost to an already demanding project. Safety remained an ongoing concern. Workers operated at height with minimal protection. Heavy materials were lifted overhead. Scaffolding shifted and aged. Accidents occurred, though records rarely captured details unless something catastrophic happened. Danger was accepted as normal. By 1797, the exterior walls stood essentially complete. The building's outline was fixed. The president's house existed in physical form, stone walls defining space, mass, and presence. But this milestone only marked the end of one phase. There was still no roof, no finished floors, no plastered walls, no warmth, no comfort. The house was recognizable, but not livable. What came next would test the project in a different way. Not just through brute force, but through craft, endurance, and the uneasy reality of who was doing the work. The focus was about to shift inward, to the people whose skills held the building together from the inside. By the late 1790s, the president's house was no longer an empty shell of rising stone. It had become a crowded, complex worksite where dozens of people labored at the same time, each bringing different skills, different freedoms, and very different futures. Understanding how the White House was built means understanding who built it. The workforce fell into two broad categories: free workers and enslaved workers. They often performed similar tasks. They worked in the same spaces. They endured the same heat, cold, mud, and danger. But the law placed them in completely unequal positions. Skilled free craftsmen, at the core of the project, were skilled tradesmen: stonemasons, carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, and blacksmiths. Many were immigrants, particularly from Britain and Ireland, who brought with them training acquired through formal apprenticeships. These men understood geometry, load-bearing structures, joinery, and finishing techniques that could not be learned quickly. Payroll records from the period preserve many of their names. They were paid weekly or monthly wages, with skilled craftsmen earning significantly more than general laborers. Their expertise gave them leverage. If conditions became unacceptable, they could leave. Though doing so in a half-built capital city carried its own risks. These craftsmen shaped the visible and invisible structure of the house, of framing floors, installing roof timbers, laying brick interior walls, carving details, and preparing surfaces for finishing. Without their skills, Hoban's design could not have been realized. Enslaved laborers, the unacknowledged backbone, but skilled free labor was not enough. The sheer physical demands of the project required far more hands than paid craftsmen alone could provide. For this, The federal government relied heavily on enslaved workers hired from their owners in Maryland and Virginia. This was not hidden or secret. It was documented. Payroll records show payments made to slave owners for Negro hire. The government paid daily or weekly rates to owners, specifying how many enslaved men were provided and for how long. The enslaved workers themselves received no wages. Their labor benefited their owners, not them. Most of this labor was unskilled but essential: digging, hauling stone, mixing mortar, clearing debris, lifting materials, and assisting craftsmen. These tasks demanded strength and endurance. They were repetitive, exhausting, and often dangerous. The records usually list numbers, not names. 3 Negro laborers. 5 hired hands. The individuals disappear into accounting entries. Enslaved skilled craftsmen. Some enslaved workers, however, possessed specialized skills. Enslaved carpenters framed floors and partitions. Enslaved masons laid brick and stone. Enslaved blacksmiths forged hardware and tools. These men performed work identical to that of free craftsmen, sometimes under supervision, sometimes with relative independence. Their skills made them valuable. A skilled enslaved worker represented profit for an owner and efficiency for the project. That value sometimes meant slightly better treatment or less direct oversight, but it never meant freedom. A skilled enslaved carpenter could shape beams, read instructions, and solve structural problems. He could still be sold. The contradiction was absolute. Working side by side on the site, cooperation was unavoidable. Free and enslaved workers worked shoulder to shoulder. A free mason might rely on enslaved laborers to hoist stone. An enslaved carpenter might assist a free master builder. Skill often mattered more than status during the work itself, but once tools were set down, the law reasserted itself. Some free craftsmen owned enslaved workers and brought them to the site. A man could be both laborer and enslaver, building the president's house alongside people he legally owned. This reality complicates any clean narrative of builders. The workforce was layered and unequal and deeply shaped by the institution of slavery. Conditions and control conditions were harsh for everyone, but choice defined the difference. Free workers endured danger, fatigue, and weather exposure, but they retained legal agency. Enslaved workers did not. They could not leave. They could not negotiate pay. They could not refuse assignments. Injuries happened. Illness happened. Exhaustion was constant. Enslaved workers were typically housed and fed by their owners, not the government. Any care provided was motivated by preserving labor value, not well-being. Some enslaved craftsmen worked with minimal supervision due to their expertise. This relative autonomy, limited and fragile, offered small moments of control, but it could be withdrawn instantly. Names lost, slowly recovered. For most of history, these enslaved builders were invisible. Only in recent decades have historians begun reconstructing their presence through painstaking archival work. By cross-referencing payroll records, correspondence, and contractor documents, scholars have recovered some names, first names only, sometimes attached to specific trades. Each recovered name represents a real person who shaped the building. Most, however, remain unnamed. A necessary truth: the White House is a symbol of democracy, executive power, and national continuity. But its walls rose through a labor system that denied democracy to many of the people who built it. That contradiction is not a flaw in the history, it is the history. Free immigrants seeking opportunity, skilled craftsmen practicing their trades, and enslaved people forced into labor all contributed to the same structure. Their efforts merged into one building, even though their lives remained divided by law and power. As the walls stood complete and the focus shifted inward, the workforce did not disappear. Their labor simply changed form, from lifting stone to shaping rooms. And now, the project entered a new phase. The building had a body. Next, it would need an interior life. With the exterior walls standing by the late 1790s, the president's house entered a phase that was less visible from a distance, but no less demanding. This was the moment when stone mass had to become livable space. The focus shifted inward toward floors, rooms, staircases, fireplaces, and the countless details that would turn a shell into a residence. James Hoban's design divided the interior vertically and deliberately. The lowest level, partially below ground, was intended for service and utility. Kitchens, storage rooms, workspaces, and servant areas occupied this floor. The goal was functional efficiency and invisibility. Labor happened here, out of sight, allowing public life above to appear effortless and refined. Movement patterns were carefully considered so servants could perform their duties without constantly crossing formal spaces. Above it sat the main floor, the heart of the house. This was the public face of the presidency. Ceilings were higher here than anywhere else, creating a sense of openness and importance. The layout allowed for processions, gatherings, and official events that reinforced authority without resorting to royal spectacle. Dominating this level was the East Room. It was the largest interior space in the building, designed for receptions, public gatherings, and major events. Its sheer scale reflected the ambition of the young nation. Adjacent rooms, later known as the Green Room, Blue Room, and Red Room, were intended for smaller receptions and transitional use, allowing guests to move fluidly between spaces. On the opposite end of the main floor, Hoban placed the State Dining Room. This room was designed to host formal dinners for diplomats and political figures. The separation between reception spaces and dining areas wasn't accidental. It controlled sound, movement, and atmosphere during official events. The second floor was private. Here, bedrooms and family sitting rooms provided space away from constant public access. This separation between public authority and private life was essential. The president was not a monarch living in permanent display, but a citizen temporarily occupying office. The architecture reinforced that idea through physical distance and controlled access. Above that, the attic level offered additional rooms and storage. These spaces were simpler, with lower ceilings and fewer decorative finishes. Over time, they would serve various purposes: guest rooms, servant quarters, and storage, but they were clearly secondary in status. The interior structure relied heavily on timber. Floor joists, beams, roof framing, all were wooden, sourced from nearby forests and cut on site. This was standard construction for the period and far more practical than stone vaulting. But it also introduced vulnerability, one that would prove catastrophic in 1814. Interior walls were built of brick or plaster over wooden lath. Brick walls supported weight and helped divide major spaces. Plaster finished the surfaces, smoothing rough structures into refined rooms. Plastering required skill and patience. It had to be applied in layers and allowed to cure properly. Damp weather could halt progress entirely. Fireplaces were essential. Each major room had at least one, connected to chimney stacks that rose through the building. Heating depended entirely on these fireplaces. Designing them correctly, ensuring proper draft, preventing smoke buildup, was critical. Early problems with chimney construction would haunt the building's first occupants. Windows were placed according to Georgian principles: symmetrical, evenly spaced, and sized according to floor importance. Main floor windows were taller, reinforcing the idea of a piano nobile. The principal level elevated in both function and appearance. Light and ventilation mattered, especially in Washington's humid summers. Despite steady progress, interior finishing lagged behind structural work. Plastering, woodwork, staircases, and decorative details took enormous time. Skilled labor was limited. Budgets were tight. Weather interfered. And above all, the clock was unforgiving. By 1800, the federal government had to move. The house was not finished, but it was expected to function anyway. When John Adams became president in November 1800, he walked into a building that looked complete from the outside but felt unfinished and uncomfortable within. The roof was on. Doors and windows were installed. The stone facade projected dignity and permanence. Inside, reality was different. Many rooms lacked plaster. Some spaces were barely usable. The east room, intended as the grandest space in the house, was unfinished entirely. Abigail Adams famously used it to hang laundry, the only practical use for such a vast, unheated room during that first winter. Heating was a constant struggle. Fireplaces were incomplete or inefficient. Chimneys malfunctioned. The sheer size of the house made warmth difficult to maintain. Washington winters were cold and damp, and the building amplified both. Furniture was scarce. The government's budget for furnishings was limited. Some items were brought from Philadelphia, but many rooms stood empty. The house felt cavernous, large, cold, and unfinished. Construction did not stop simply because the president had moved in. Workers continued plastering, fitting woodwork, and completing rooms while the Adams family lived among scaffolding and tools. The coexistence of household life and construction created constant inconvenience. Noise, dust, and limited privacy were unavoidable. The grounds outside were equally unfinished. The surrounding area looked more like a work site than a presidential landscape. Mud dominated in wet weather. Roads were poor. The vision of a grand capital still existed mostly on paper. Abigail Adams's letters from this period offer rare insight. She described the discomfort honestly, without exaggeration, but without illusion. The president's house was usable in the strictest sense. It was not yet a home. John Adams stayed only 4 months. After losing the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, he left Washington quietly in early 1801. His brief residence established an important precedent. The house could be occupied before it was complete. Function had overtaken comfort. But Adams's experience also exposed the gap between ambition and reality. The president's house had been designed to project stability and dignity. In 1800, it achieved that only from a distance. Inside, it remained a work in progress, unfinished, uncomfortable, and evolving. That evolution would accelerate under the next president. Because Thomas Jefferson, unlike Adams, did not see the house merely as something to occupy. He saw it as something to shape. By the early 1800s, the president's house had finally begun to resemble the vision James Hoban had imagined. Rooms were finished. Daily routines had settled. The capital city around it, though still incomplete, was growing into itself. The house had survived doubt, delay, and discomfort. What no one expected was that it would soon face near total destruction. On August 24, 1814, during the War of 1812, British forces marched into Washington, D.C. The war itself had already been costly and frustrating for the young United States. But this moment would strike at something deeper than military loss. It would attack the nation's identity. Earlier that day, American forces had attempted to stop the British at the Battle of Bladensburg. They failed. The defeat left Washington essentially defenseless. With no effective resistance remaining, the road to the capital lay open. President James Madison and his cabinet fled the city. The president's house was left behind. First Lady Dolly Madison stayed longer than most. As British troops advanced, she focused on preserving what could be saved. Official papers, letters, and national documents were gathered and removed. Most famously, she ordered the rescue of the full-length portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart. The painting was too large to carry intact, so the frame was broken and the canvas cut free. It was an act of urgency, but also of symbolism. Saving Washington's image meant preserving continuity. The nation might be attacked, but its founding story would not be erased. After Dolly Madison evacuated, British soldiers entered the president's house. Accounts describe the building still set for dinner, food laid out, wine poured. Officers reportedly ate before beginning their work. Whether every detail is exact or later embellished, the core truth remains. The house was violated. Then it was burned. British forces deliberately set fires throughout the building. They targeted interior spaces where timber framing, floors, stairs, and roof structures would burn fastest. The flames consumed everything combustible. Furniture, curtains, woodwork, plaster, all were destroyed. The heat cracked stone in places. Smoke blackened the walls. What survived was the shell. The Aquia Creek sandstone exterior walls stood, scarred but intact. Stone does not burn easily, and those walls, laid with such care decades earlier, now determined whether the house would live again. The destruction didn't stop there. That same night, British forces burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and other government buildings. The attack was systematic, intended as retaliation for American actions in Canada and as a psychological blow. Washington glowed in flames visible miles away. Nature, ironically, intervened. A violent storm moved through the city the following day, bringing heavy rain that extinguished many remaining fires. Some accounts even describe a tornado. Whether myth or meteorology, the result was the same. The destruction stopped short of total annihilation. The British withdrew soon after. What they left behind was a capital in ruins. When American officials returned, the president's house stood as a burned shell, roofless, hollow, uninhabitable. Everything inside was gone. The building that had taken 8 years to construct had been destroyed in a single night. Immediately, a question emerged that went beyond architecture. Should Washington even remain the capital? Some argued the city had failed its first test. It was vulnerable, underdeveloped, and now symbolically wounded. Suggestions surfaced to move the capital back to Philadelphia or another established city. Rebuilding would be expensive. Abandoning Washington might be easier. But abandoning it would mean something else. It would mean admitting that the Compromise of 1790 had failed. President Madison and Congress chose otherwise. The decision was made to rebuild, not elsewhere, but here. Reconstructing the president's house became more than a practical necessity. It became a statement. The British could burn the Capitol. They could not erase it. James Hoban, the original architect, was called back to oversee reconstruction. No one knew the building better. No one was better positioned to restore it. The surviving walls would become the foundation for rebirth. For months, the ruin stood as a reminder, charred stone against the sky, a visible scar on the nation's pride. But within that ruin was opportunity. The shell remained. The form endured. The White House had not died. It was waiting to rise again. Reconstruction of the president's house began in earnest in 1815. What stood after the fire was not a building, but a shell, stone walls scorched by smoke, interiors reduced to ash. Timber beams collapsed into blackened debris. Yet those surviving walls mattered more than anyone realized at the moment. They made rebuilding possible. They made continuity possible. James Hoban returned to the site, now no longer a place of construction but of recovery. He knew every proportion, every load, bearing wall, every compromise already embedded in the structure. His task was not to redesign the president's house, but to resurrect it. The first step was assessment. Engineers and builders examined the sandstone walls carefully. Some sections had cracked under intense heat. Other stones were weakened and had to be replaced. But the foundations were sound. The basic structure had held. That single fact saved years of work and enormous cost. Debris from the burned interior had to be cleared before rebuilding could begin. Charred beams, collapsed floors, ash, and broken stone were removed by hand. Only after the interior was emptied could reconstruction move forward. This work alone took months. Congress approved funding for the project in stages. Money was limited, but the symbolic importance of rebuilding outweighed hesitation. The president's house was not just a residence. It was proof that the capital would remain in Washington, that the nation would not retreat under pressure. Once stabilization was complete, reconstruction followed the original design closely. Hoban rebuilt the interior almost entirely from scratch. Timber framing rose again, floor by floor. Beams were set, joists laid, and staircases rebuilt. Brick interior walls were reconstructed. Plasterers returned to shape walls and ceilings that had vanished in the fire. Some improvements were quietly introduced. Chimney systems were refined to improve heating and draft. Structural weaknesses identified during earlier use were corrected. But these were adjustments, not transformations. The goal was restoration, not reinvention. Stone repairs required special care. Replacement blocks were quarried again from Aquia Creek to ensure color and texture matched the original masonry. Stonecutters shaped replacements to blend seamlessly with surviving walls. The building would not look patched, it would look whole. By late 1817, the president's house was once again habitable. President James Monroe and his family moved in, becoming the first occupants of the rebuilt structure. Finishing work continued into 1818, but the house had returned to life. And this time, it looked different. During reconstruction, the exterior was coated in white paint. Partly this covered smoke stains and fire damage. Partly it protected the sandstone from weathering. Whitewashing stone buildings was common practice at the time, but the effect was striking. The tan sandstone disappeared beneath a clean, uniform surface. The building had become white. The name, White House, did not immediately follow. Official documents continued using President's House or Executive Mansion, but people noticed. Newspapers, letters, and casual conversation began using the descriptive nickname. Over time, it stuck. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt made it official. A practical decision during Reconstruction had reshaped national identity. Through the 19th century, the White House continued to evolve. The South Portico was added in 1824. The North Portico followed in 1829, completing Hoban's original vision. Gas lighting replaced candles. Running water arrived. Electricity followed. Heating systems improved. Interior spaces were repurposed again and again as the presidency expanded. Yet through all those changes, the core endured. The walls raised by free craftsmen and enslaved laborers still stood. The proportions Hoban designed still defined the building. The compromises, ambitions, and contradictions of the 1790s remained embedded in stone. And so did the legacy. For much of American history, the people who built the White House were largely invisible in its story, especially the enslaved workers whose labor made construction possible. Only in recent decades has that history been openly acknowledged through research, education, and public markers. Names have been recovered where records allow. Stories have been restored where silence once existed. That acknowledgement does not weaken the White House as a symbol. It strengthens it. Because the White House is not powerful because it is perfect. It is powerful because it endures. It holds contradiction. It survives fire, war, political division, and time itself. The building that began as mud and stone beside the Potomac still serves its original purpose more than 2 centuries later. Presidents come and go. Policies rise and fall, but the structure remains adapted, repaired, repainted, yet fundamentally the same. When people speak of the White House today, they rarely mean just the building. They mean the presidency, executive power, the voice of the United States. But beneath that meaning is something older and more human. Labor, compromise, skill, survival. The White House was not born finished. It was argued into existence, built under pressure, burned by an enemy, and rebuilt by determination. Its story begins not with ceremonies, but with construction, and it continues because those foundations, literal and historical, were strong enough to hold. This is why the White House still stands.